of 2024-2025. Very happy that you can join us on this beautiful Friday afternoon. We've got a great guest. I'm excited to have you listen to him. My name is Ian Bernhoft. I coordinate the forum, which is an initiative of the Humanities program. And why is it here? Its aim is to give you a chance to deepen your intellectual life outside of the classroom, right? To encounter new ideas, new perspectives, new research from scholars, writers, professors, journalists from around the country, around the world, and thereby to deepen your appreciation of the humanities, ultimately. There's a few ground rules, which I'm going to tell you before I hand the microphone. Oh yeah, we're cooking. Before I hand the microphone over to our presenter. So the first is those screens you got out. I want you to close them down. Why? Because then you can actually, give your eyes a rest, look at what's happening in the front of the room, use your ears, notice your neighbors, all that kind of thing. I think you'll like it. If you want to replay it, I'll post it on YouTube next week, and you got it made. So that's rule number one. Rule number two is what to expect. We have about a 45-minute talk. There's Q&A at the end, and a student has to ask the first question. So listen critically, listen actively, come up with a good question. And when you raise your hand and we make eye contact, wait for the mic to get to you, say your name, say your question. We'll go from there. Third and final point is we have a reception afterwards right down the hall in the great room. It's a tasty, high-calorie way to start your weekend. So with that, I'm going to hand the microphone over to my colleague, Tony Passero O'Malley, who's going to introduce tonight's speaker.
Hi, happy Friday, everyone. So just to give a little bit of perspective, if this is your first Humanities Forum or you've been to them before, the lineup is done months and months in advance. So our first foray into inviting Diego and welcoming him to our campus took place December of 2023. So now a year and a half later, we have the pleasure of joining him here. I think whatever I can say as an introduction won't really do it justice. Professor Diego Javier Luis received his PhD in history from Brown University, so this is sort of a homecoming for him as well. He was in the Humanities program, History and Latin American Studies departments at Davidson College, and the Department of History, Department of Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora at Tufts University. And currently, he is the Rohrbach Family Assistant Professor at Johns Hopkins University. He is a historian of Latin America, specializing in the connections between Mexico and the Philippines during the Manila galleon period, roughly covering the years 1565 to 1815. His work focuses on the global scope of the early modern Spanish Empire by examining the movement of people across the Pacific Ocean and how that movement transformed societies at both the eastern and western termini of the galleon trade. Diego's book, The First Asians in the Americas, A Trans-Pacific History, was published through Harvard University Press in 2024. It is the first book to examine the full scope of free and enslaved early modern Asian mobility to and through the Americas during the entirety of the Manila galleon period. He adopts a global microhistorical orientation to exemplify both the inviolable importance of the Pacific world to the colonial Americas and how the emergence of the, quote, Chino-China, in parentheses, Asian category, became central to the lived realities of colonial racialization and the articulation of new identities. And so just a selection of some of the reviews of Diego's book include, for instance, The First Asians in the Americas is essential reading for anybody interested in the histories of global migration, race, and colonization in the Americas. Diego Javier Luis has pieced together the most comprehensive and fascinating history to date of Asians in colonial Mexico. The book is a groundbreaking study of Asian diasporic experiences in the Spanish Empire. The First Asians in the Americas was awarded the Thomas J. Wilson Memorial Prize by Harvard University Press, and this prize is given to the best first book in any field, published through Harvard University Press, along with the Howard F. Klein Prize in Mexican History and the Forum on Early Modern Empires and Global Interactions Book Prize. Diego's work has also appeared in the journals Ethnohistory, Rethinking History, The Americas, a quarterly review of Latin American history, the Journal of Colonialism and Colonial History, and Smithsonian Folklife, among others. Diego's also working on numerous other book-length projects, including Manila and Acapulco, A Tale of Two Cities in the Early Modern Black Pacific, and a history of early modern Spanish fencing called La Verdadera Destreza, or The True Skill, where Diego explores how ideas about fencing, which was then considered a science, informed colonial ethnography across the global Spanish Empire and became an important form of social mobility and colonial contestation for non-Spanish subjects. And as a practitioner of early modern fencing, this project blends experiential methodologies and self-writing along with archival research. And in the fall of 2022, it was my pleasure to host a discussion with Diego about his photography and specifically his exhibit titled A Few Missing Visuals of the Crisis, Unos Visuales Ausentes de la Crisis, which depicts the spaces and places in South Texas at the Mexico-US border. Diego is a published photographer, and his photography has been exhibited at the Van Every Smith Galleries at Davidson College and the Tufts Tisch Gallery. He is also a scholar of historical game studies, and he is co-creator of the Historians Table podcast. So please join me in welcoming Professor Diego Javier Luis to Providence College.
Thank you so much. All right, can everybody hear? Everyone hear me okay? All right, thank you so much for the generous introduction and for the invitation to speak with you all today. It's truly my honor to present my work to you. This talk comes from a book that I published recently that you just heard about, a little bit about, The First Asians in the Americas, A Trans-Pacific History. And I'm going to be taking us straight into a time and place that is likely unfamiliar to many of us today. And so I would invite you to let yourself be swept along in the journey, right? And I can assure you that it will become, that this time and place, the 17th century, the Spanish Pacific, Latin America, the Philippines, this will all become more clear as I speak. So in the tradition of global microhistory, I'm going to begin by throwing us all into the deep zone with an anecdote. On July 10th, 1659, the howls of barking dogs filled the night air in the neighborhood called Espiritu Santo in the city of Santiago de Guatemala, which is in what is today Guatemala. The clamor awoke a Cachiquel Maya resident named Maria Cetina. Suspicious, she forced herself out of bed and checked her home to see if anything was amiss. She soon discovered with great alarm that one of her family's only possessions, a bundle of clothes, was now missing. Fully awake, Cetina rushed out of the house and down the road to the residence of Bartolomé Matias, the indigenous alguacil mayor, or chief constable. She roused him and his two assistants from their slumber and quickly explained that someone had just robbed her family. The constable, Bartolomé, and his companions set out immediately, and at approximately 4 a.m., they found a disheveled man they would later describe as a quote-unquote mulatto, passed out over a bench next to a rather suspicious bundle of clothes. The indigenous officials awoke that man and began questioning him. Why was he sleeping on the bench? Were these his clothes? The man explained that sleep had simply overcome him, and that he did not know whose clothes were in the bundle, and that they could take the clothes if they would kindly let him walk free. Unsatisfied, the officials then named the mulatto, the person they called a mulatto, the thief who had robbed Cetina and her family. The man soon confessed, and the officials promptly escorted him to the public prison. The next day, a scribe recorded the culprit's testimony, and this is when something rather remarkable happened that connects this seemingly unrelated anecdote to the subject of this talk. The man, who was initially described as a mulatto, told the scribe that his name was Diego de la Cruz and that he had been born as a slave in Manila, the center of Spanish colonial operations in the Philippines and indeed in Asia more broadly. And I put this map up here. It's a manuscript map from a royal cosmographer of the Indies, a guy named Juan López de Velasco from the late 16th century, and we can see how this projection of empire shows that it did not extend merely from Spain to the Americas, but indeed all the way to the Philippines. We have a pointer here. We have this dotted line showing the shipping routes between Mexico and the Philippines, which I'll talk about in just a second. So alongside alongside Diego's enslaver, a man named Diego Ruiz, he had embarked on one of the famed Manila galleons, which connected the port of Cavite in the Philippines, right, to that of Acapulco in Mexico, from 1565 to 1815. So over the 250 years of their operation, these galleons navigated the world's largest ocean and supplied the principal link connecting Asia to the Americas during the early modern period. Almost exactly 3 years before Diego's capture in Santiago de Guatemala, a galleon named Nuestra Señora de la Victoria, or Our Lady of Victory, had departed Cavite in the Philippines for Mexico. The west to east Pacific crossing typically lasted 5 to 6 months on average. Right? This is without stopping to take on supplies. The galleons first had to navigate through the Philippine archipelago to what was called the Embocadero, which is now the San Bernardino Strait on the eastern side of the Philippines. Then they rode what's called the Kuroshio Current up to Japan, right? So they went north from the Philippines up around the latitude of Japan, and then turned east across the North Pacific until sighting Cape Mendocino in what's now Northern California. And then, after hitting the coast, they would veer south, following it all the way down to Acapulco in Mexico. This galleon, however, did not appear off the Mexican coast until March of 1657, 8 months later, after departing in the Philippines, when coastal sentinels reported spotting a derelict ship floating south without any sign of movement on board. While it was not unusual for a galleon to lose even upwards of 30% of its crew on a Pacific crossing, almost everyone who had been on board this ship, the Nuestra Señora de la Victoria, had died, including Diego's enslaver. The ship ran aground near the port of Amapala in what is now Honduras. We can see here the Gulf of Amapala in Central America. Upon landing, a band of survivors, both free and enslaved, then fled into the countryside. Diego had been on the run for 2 years in this strange land when he was finally apprehended and jailed in Santiago de Guatemala as a thief. However, it was not until Diego's formal sentencing to the customary 50 lashes and sale to one of the Spanish America's notorious textile mills, which were called obrajes, that Spanish judges now referred to Diego as a quote-unquote chino. So recall that Matias, the indigenous constable, had initially called Diego a mulatto. Mulatto was a label signaling both a vague otherness and Afro-descendants, typically Afro-European or Afro-indigenous heritage. This marker linked Diego to the social imaginary of rebellious marronage, so runaway communities, fusing racial categorization with alleged criminality. Identification as a chino, meanwhile, formally linked Diego for the first time to the thousands of free and enslaved Asians of enormous ethno-linguistic diversity that disembarked the Manila galleons in the Americas. They came from Gujarat, in what's now India, Nagasaki in Japan, and everywhere between, though the overwhelming majority came from the Philippines, various locales in the Philippines, and in South Asia, especially the Bay of Bengal. The Manila galleons and the global mobility of people facilitated across the Pacific made the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which was based in Mexico City, the center of not only the Atlantic world, right? Going back here, not only the center of the Atlantic world during the 16th and 17th centuries, as identified by earlier scholarship, but also of the Pacific world. Right? While most Asians arrived at the Mexican port of Acapulco, the case of Diego de la Cruz demonstrates that the people called chinos could be found throughout the colonial Americas by the middle of the 17th century. So in my recently published book, I argued that chinos were a new kind of malleable and globally mobile subject in world history. They occupied a wide range of social statuses that we might consider paradoxical today. Right? They could be free or enslaved. They could be considered white or black, or any gradation between. They could be poor laborers or members of the lower elite who themselves owned slaves. They could be Asian, they could be mixed, they could be Catholic, they could be Muslim, or they could hold other spiritual beliefs entirely. The only commonality that all people who are called chinos shared is precisely the constructed, racialized nature of their colonial trans-Pacific identifications. Within this configuration, I'm seeking to argue today that at the core of the convergence of the Atlantic and the Pacific worlds in New Spain was the Afro-Asian encounter. In Diego's case, his perceived physical and legal ambiguity had marked him as both mulatto and as chino, which recreates the Afro-Asian binary through the personhood categories of caste, or in Spanish, casta, of which the terms mulatto and chino are part, that were ascribed to him. So, of course, in Manila, where he said he was from, it was not terribly uncommon to be identified as both black and Asian. His Spanish and indigenous counterparts' unfamiliarity with the demographic realities of colonialism in the Philippines had produced a crisis of racialized categorization in the Americas. So the field of Afro-Asian studies has arrived relatively recently to Latin American historiography and has focused exclusively on the 19th through 21st centuries. Within these chronologies, Cuba has received the most attention, and for good reason. From 1847 to 1874, hundreds of thousands of enslaved Afro-Cubans and some 125,000 Chinese indentured laborers toiled side by side on plantations primarily, and occasionally they raised arms together against the Spanish colonial regime. So the Afro-Asian framework investigates how people from two seemingly isolated poles, the Afro and the Asian, created new connections, new solidarities, and new intimacies against the grain of global empire. And I put this wonderful artwork by one of the most renowned international Cuban artists, Maria Magdalena Campos Pons. This piece is called Finding Balance, and in it she interweaves both her Afro-Cuban and Chinese heritage. So the Afro-Asian field offers an intervention in the study of what we call mestizaje and mulataje, or the different kinds of mixing that were very common to Latin America during the colonial period, and that furthermore lie at the heart of Latin American history. Rather than compartmentalize the study of ethno-linguistic groups, as is often the default mode of analysis, Afro-Asian methodologies create a language for examining how colonial social and labor structures, as well as racial ideologies, produced unprecedented cross-cultural, spiritual, and sexual contexts that exceed the analytical frames of traditional historiographies, but certainly not the experiential frames of the people who lived those realities. Diego de la Cruz's story, and those of others like him, affirm the necessity of linking the global with the local. The lives of people who are systematically written out of historical meta-narratives of colonialism in Latin America are necessary to understand what made the hemisphere distinctly global in ways that colonial officials both did not anticipate and rarely cared to record. So this is not a story of material circulation for which the Manila galleons, known better for facilitating a silver for silk trade across the Pacific, are primarily known, but this is precisely a story of the movement of people. However, Diego de la Cruz also exemplifies the limitations of the Afro-Asian field as it has developed. At the port of Acapulco, the markets, which is represented here, the markets of Mexico City, and even in a quiet neighborhood of Santiago de Guatemala, which you've just heard about, there was an early modern Afro-Asian encounter that predates the field's chronological focus by 3 centuries. The early Afro-Asian encounter urgently pertains to the unique global connectedness of New Spain, to understudied multi-ethnic formations in colonial Latin America, and the development of colonial race thinking and its inability to encapsulate the transformed meanings of early modern identities. So the case of Diego de la Cruz problematizes both the Afro and the Asian sides of the Afro-Asian construct and reveals that the two categories were considerably more fluid and interconnected legally, diasporically, and tactically than they may initially appear. To begin, Diego de la Cruz, his various identification as a mulatto and a chino raises a seemingly simple but actually very complex question, which I'll devote a few minutes to, which is who were the chinos of the colonial Americas and why were they called chinos? Of course, chino refers formally to the native inhabitants of China in contemporary Spanish and in Spanish at the time. But to most scholars of the period, chino conjures the image of 18th century casta paintings. And this is a detail from one such casta painting, which you can find in art museums really all over the country, and most notably the Denver Art Museum, as well as in many other places. So these paintings, if you've never seen them before, they depicted dozens of caste category permutations, basically what combination of parents would produce what kind of descendant, and overall they were a warning of how pure Spanish bloodlines could disappear through generations of intermixing with indigenous and Afro-descendant people. In these paintings, chino was often an Afro-indigenous mixed category, as we see here. So this is from an indigenous man and a mixed woman, then their child is categorized as chino. And this is from a casta painting by Ignacio Maria Barrera from 1777. So for this reason, some scholars have suggested that there were either no Asians or an inconsequential number of Asians in the early Americas, right? If you look at these casta paintings. However, even a cursory examination of archival records from 150 years prior, near the onset of the 17th century, indeed reveals that chino generally referred not to Chinese or Afro-indigenous people, but to Asians in the broadest sense. Chino was a colonial Mexican invention that designated a new kind of colonial subject when it became a marker of Asian difference in 1615. For the first time in the history of the Americas, a single word could refer to any person identified as having originated in the lands across the Pacific. And perhaps the best known example is that of a South Asian holy woman who was named Catarina de San Juan, who was commonly referred to as the quote-unquote China of Puebla. And this is an image of Catarina de San Juan. And interestingly enough, it's the only image that survives of an Asian person who survived the galleon crossing during this period. However, becoming a Chino in Mexico was not merely a matter of terminology. The term carried numerous legal implications that could actually determine, one, the legitimacy or not of one's enslavement, one's vulnerability to inquisitorial denunciation, one's ability to enroll in institutions of learning, ability to perform certain trades like cutting hair, for example, the right to carry weapons, and even spatial mobility, so where one could live, right? As such, Chino was a racializing term that homogenized free and enslaved Asians in Mexico and thrust them into the emergent sistema de castas, or caste system. This use of Chino was markedly different from the word's use in the Philippines at the same time, where these people who were called Chinos had embarked for the Americas. In the Philippines, Chino referred solely to Chinese people. The word came from China, or La China, which were the words commonly used to refer to the Kingdom of China. Interestingly, in 1676, the Dominican missionary Domingo Fernandez Navarrete wrote that China was itself a European invention. China or China was a European invention. According to him, the word China was a fusion of two words in Mandarin Chinese. Xing from Xinghui, which was a formal greeting, and Nan, meaning south. So Navarrete, however, recognized that this was not at all what Chinese people used to refer to their own kingdom, which was Zhongguo, or the kingdom in the middle, as in his words, the kingdom in the middle kingdom. In the Philippines, the Chino construction was used interchangeably with another, sangley. This term, sangley, entered Spanish use through the Tagalog pronunciation of the Chinese changlai, for which we have characters up here. in the top left. Or rather the Fujianese or Hokkien pronunciation of those characters, right? A particular local dialect of Chinese. And this word or this phrase, changlai, means coming frequently. So Chinese people in the Philippines were regularly called both chinos and sanglayes. What distinguished chinos in Manila from other Asians in the colonies was their relationship to the Spanish crown. They were not formally designated as tribute subjects from lands claimed by Spain or Portugal. Furthermore, most of them were not Christian converts, even those who lived in Manila. So chinos in the Philippines were not indios, which is the other word used to refer to formal vassal subjects of the Spanish Empire. Indio, of course, was a word that referred to primarily to indigenous people in the Americas. The invention of the word dates to Columbus's head-spinning confusion about his arrival in the Caribbean, in which he believed that he had found the route to Asia across the Atlantic and not, in fact, a quote-unquote new world. However, this word and this invention of Indio, meaning Indian, formally, traveled back to Asia on the lips of Spanish officials and applied equally to the inhabitants of the Philippines, for example, as it did to indigenous people in the Americas. So these Philippine realities all but ensured that there were clear distinctions between people who were called chinos and people who were called indios from many different groups in the Philippine archipelago and beyond. However, a more unstable relationship exists between the category of indio and categories of blackness in Spanish colonial language, like the categories of negro and mulatto in the Philippines. For example, indigenous Austronesian inhabitants of the archipelago were pejoratively called negrillos or negritos, which is the diminutive form of the word. Spaniards assigned this label for the Austronesian supposed physical resemblance to Africans, and the Jesuit Francisco Colin even hypothesized in 1663 that the Austronesian inhabitants of the Philippines had migrated east into the Pacific from Ethiopia. In the Philippines, categories of blackness were not only Asian indigenous, but also Afro-diasporic too. By the mid-16th century, thousands of East Africans, most of whom were enslaved, entered the Indian Ocean world every year, primarily from the Horn of Africa and the Zambezi Delta. Right? So many of us are familiar with the transatlantic slave trade, right? But there was also a slave trade going in the other direction into the Indian Ocean world, which also culminates or has its own kind of center in Manila in the Philippines. In this zone, Iberian enslavers referred to East Africans as quote-unquote kafres, after the Arabic kafir for non-believer. Over time, this word came to differentiate East Africans in the Hispanic world from West and West Central Africans who were displaced to the Americas via the Atlantic world. In coastal zones of the Indian Ocean, Africans mixed with local populations, creating Afro-Asian kinship networks and cultural convergences that predated European arrival. Portuguese enslavers, when they entered the Indian Ocean, beginning in the late 15th century and going into the 16th and 17th centuries, extended these and other regional networks of enslavement to the Philippines. Right? I put this image up here. This is perhaps the best-known colonial map of the Philippines from the early 18th century, and it includes a number of ethnographic panels, so people that one could expect to find or encounter in the Philippines. And in this panel here, we have a representation of kafres, or East Africans, right, as inhabitants of the Philippines. So a legal testimony from May of 1603 in Manila further exemplifies the inability of Spanish colonial language to represent ethnicity or origin in the Philippines. In 1603, three Chinese officials had arrived in the city to demand tributes and exercise their authority over who they considered their subjects, right, including the Spaniards in the Philippines, which is a position that Spaniards sometimes bought into in order to ingratiate themselves with the Ming Dynasty court. One unfortunate victim of this visit in 1603 was a man that the three officials had publicly whipped for attempting to sell residential licenses to the recently disembarked Chinese laborers, which was a common kind of scam to make money. Spanish witnesses variously described this man who was whipped as a quote-unquote mulatto, as an indio, and as a negro. And none could agree as to whom this man was or where he came from, until a witness finally declared definitively that the man was from Cagayan in the Philippines. Right? So you have an example there of the conflation of categories of a person who is indigenous to the Philippines. And this is a contemporary art piece by Philippine artists showing the arrival of the three officials carried on the shoulders of their retinue. Okay, so all of these factors, So the lines separating these socially constructed categories began to blur during the Pacific crossing on the Manila galleons, right? So non-Europeans generally made the Pacific crossing through one of two means, either as sailors or as captives. Most non-European sailors occupied the lowest rung of the shipboard hierarchy. They were called grumetes, or cabin boys, right? So these grumetes lived and labored side by side, regardless of ethno-linguistic group. Collectively, they made the lowest wages, which was 4 pesos per month on average. Generally, the enslaved and the grumetes suffered the worst conditions on board during the crossing, and they became the voyage's first casualties due to exposure to cold weather, lack of warm clothing due to vitamin-deficient diets, starvation, and risky laboring conditions, especially during storms, which were ubiquitous in the North Pacific part of the crossing. Additionally, the people who were the grumetes on board experienced the Catholic rituals of galleon travel, regardless of missionary jurisdiction, which in the Philippines had often been divided by ethno-linguistic group or specific geography, right? So the Dominicans were assigned the Chinese population, for example. The Augustinians assigned other Philippine populations, right? So these were divided by missionary order on the galleons. Those distinctions ceased to matter. And this is a representation of really of the small area on the deck of a Manila galleon in which people were put into contact. So all of these factors began a process of what I call notarial homogenization for those who survived the Pacific Passage, meaning the earliest accounting records for Acapulco, which date from 1590, demonstrate that Treasury officials already were making important distinctions between Asian subjects who arrived on the galleons and indigenous subjects in the Americas. So while specific identifiers appear in these records, like Lascar, which was a word referring to a South Asian sailor, and Pampanga, which was a particular locale in the Philippines, while those distinctions occasionally appear in these records, most Asians initially became called Indios Chinos in Acapulco. The Indio-Chino label simultaneously designated Asians as Indios, or vassal subjects of overseas territories claimed by the crown, and Chinos. As a referent to nearly any person perceived as Asian arriving in Acapulco, the meaning of Chino had clearly shifted from its use in the Philippines to solely designate inhabitants of the Kingdom of China. And in truth, relatively few Chinese made the Trans-Pacific crossing during this period. Colonial records provide no explanation whatsoever for this change. However, the practice of using one term as a label for many was already common throughout the Spanish Empire. In Pedro de Medina's Libro de Grandezas y Cosas Memorables de España, or Book of the Great and Memorable Things of Spain, which was published in 1542, the author writes that the term Moro, meaning Moor or Muslim, originally came from the word Mauro, the Spanish word for people from Mauritania in northwest Africa. Since Mauros had been considered Muslims for centuries, all Muslims, regardless of where exactly they came from, became known as Moros. Right? In a similar vein, another scholar named Ricardo Padron found that Samar, the first island in the Philippines to be spotted on the journey west across the Pacific, had originally been called La Isla Filipina, or the Philippine Island. And eventually this name, quote, was extended to the entire archipelago, end quote. And as a final example, the Jesuit Francisco Colin shows the process by which or explains the process by which the Philippines acquired its name, that process paralleled that of Las Canarias, or the Canary Islands, which were named after the big island of Gran Canaria. Right? So we have this structure of naming entire island chains or entire groups of people from one particular example. In New Spain, the best-known Asian polity was precisely the Kingdom of China, due in part to the Spanish fascination with China and the crates of Chinese goods like silk and porcelain and lacquer, which arrived every year on the galleons. La China quickly became the stand-in, the cartographic and textual stand-in or offhand term for the larger geography of coastal Asia, which coexisted alongside the other common reference for Asia, which were Las Indias Occidentales, or Las Indias del Poniente, or the West Indies, right? The East Indies, or the Indies of the setting sun. The West Indies, west with respect to Spain. It was all west with respect to Spain. Consequently, the peoples of seemingly ambiguous provenance who arrived at Acapulco were called the Indios of La China, or simply Indios Chinos. Between 1590 and 1615, the Indio-Chino label became synonymous with Chino in Acapulco's treasury records. So while the difference between an Indio-Chino and a Chino was inconsequential for the purposes of these records, that's to say the logging of wages, that's essentially what these records did, the transition from Indio-Chino to Chino effectively removed Asians who were arriving in Mexico from the nominal protections of the Indio category, right? So while people who were labeled Indio were regularly forced to give their goods, their lands, and their bodies to the colonial regime, they were also supposed to be exempt from certain types of labor and from enslavement. But of course, we know from the work of Andrés Reséndez and many others that colonial regulations of this sort rarely stuck. What this meant is the pretension of royal charity meant that, at least meant that violations of this doctrine of exploitation could be challenged in colonial court, right? So crucially, most people who were called Chinos in Mexico had been Indios in the Philippines, and therefore they were nominally protected, right? Therefore, Chino effectively created a new enslavable and legally vulnerable category of colonial subject. Chinos entered the constellation of castas or castes in New Spain, which was comprised primarily of black people who were called negros and mulattos, and Spanish indigenous mixed people called mestizos. Numerous laws dictating their vulnerability to the Inquisition, eligibility for certain guild memberships, and spatial restrictions now applied to Chinos because they were a caste alongside these other groups now. At the time of its emergence, Chino was therefore a close legal approximation to categories of blackness in colonial society. And I'm showing in these images the slow kind of transition from various types of categorization to a single categorization. In Acapulco's treasury records, this shift becomes decisive in 1615. From that date, there's no longer any fluidity in the labels used to refer to Asians at the port. Again, colonial records do not explain why, but a glance at what was happening in Acapulco during this year actually allows us to make an educated guess. In October of 1615, a Dutch fleet of 5 vessels occupied the port of Acapulco for a week, prompting the immediate construction of a fort called the Fort of San Diego. Under the command of an engineer named Adrian Boots, some 700 indigenous laborers from surrounding lands were forced to converge at the port and begin leveling the headland upon which the fort would sit. The Chino label became dominant in Acapulco precisely as large numbers of non-Asian Indios arrived at the port from the surrounding area. Thus, the Chino label more reliably distinguished trans-Pacific subjects from their indigenous counterparts than did the Indio-Chino label, right? Which was still somewhat ambiguous. Consequently, Asians became visible now throughout central Mexico as undifferentiated Chinos. So while the Indio-Chino label occasionally persists outside of Acapulco, mainly as a strategy to reclaim the Indio protections that were lost in Acapulco, Chino now becomes the dominant referent. However, the great ethno-linguistic diversity of non-European people entering Acapulco every year all but ensured that Chino would remain a capacious, fluid, and vague marker of trans-Pacific otherness. Spanish officials displayed basically no awareness of this diversity of people subsumed within the Chino category until they debated the legitimacy of Chino enslavement from 1672 to 1675. In 1672, Martín de Solís Miranda recognized that, who was a Spanish official in Mexico City, he recognized that the Chino label was a, quote, name used abusively and not with accuracy, since those that are called and termed this are actually the Indios of the Philippine Islands, which are very distant from what he called La Gran China, or the Great China, whose inhabitants are those who should accurately be called Chinos, end quote. For another official, Fernando de Haro y Monterroso, who was ultimately the emancipator of Chinos in Mexico, for him the term referred to all, quote, Indios born in the Philippine Islands who are Japanese, Tartars, Malucan, Sanglayes, Mindanaos, Bengalas, Makassars, Malays, and other nations next to and close to the great island of La Gran China, which provided the word that is used in New Spain, end quote. Great island of China notwithstanding, the definition of Chino did not matter until it could determine who could be liberated from enslavement and who would remain in bondage. However, these rare formal definitions leave out the term's relationship, of course, to the categories of blackness, which we began with. The fluidity of blackness in the Indian Ocean and Pacific worlds reappears in the Americas. Like all caste labels, the Chino category was vague and capacious, such that it could acquire additional descriptors that were situationally dependent. As early as 1604, an enslaver in Mexico City named Francisco de Medina described the enslaved Vicente, an enslaved man named Vicente, as a, quote, negro Chino, and then just as a negro, in an attempt to block Vicente's marriage to another enslaved woman who was labeled as a China. So the enslaver failed in his quest to block this marriage, but the proposed block relied upon a kind of discrediting of character through the strategic deployment of labels indicating Asianness and blackness and the social deviancy that these categories had come to imply in colonial society. So in fact, multi-ethnic convergences of the kind that this marriage implies was a defining reality of trans-Pacific enslavement in colonial Mexico in ways that went far beyond Medina's name-calling. In Mexico City in 1651, an enslaved man named Antonio Rosado blasphemed publicly during Mass at an obraje, which was again a textile mill, and an image of which appears here. As a scholar named Javier Villaflores has long established, public blasphemy was a common Afro-Mexican strategy to contest the legitimacy of excessive punishment within enslavement. Right? So this seems kind of paradoxical, right? Why expose oneself to the Inquisition in order to try to get out of a kind of punishment? But by invoking the jurisdiction of the Inquisition, an enslaved person had an opportunity to argue that the extreme conditions of their enslavement had driven them to commit blasphemy, right? That they hadn't wanted to, but that extreme punishment drove them to do so. These blasphemies ultimately were a blemish on the reputations of their enslavers, because enslavement itself was predicated on the obligation of the enslaver to teach his or her captives to become good Christians. So blasphemy under duress was a violation of the spiritual contract between enslaver and enslaved. During the proceedings, inquisitors and witnesses described Antonio as both a mulatto and of the Chino caste. However, when he was asked to give a kind of summary of his life, Antonio testified that he had been born in Portuguese Goa, which is today in India. His father had been mixed with both Portuguese and East African heritage by way of Mozambique. His mother was from the Spice Islands of Ternate in what is now Indonesia. Not only was Antonio himself mixed, but he had also learned the Afro-Mexican social practice of blasphemy to try to evade excessively harsh treatment in his enslaver's textile mill. Antonio received, ultimately, the best possible resolution to the case, which was transfer to another enslaver. While this ruling indeed came with its own risks, in situations of extreme duress, enslaved people often took this chance in an attempt to improve their living conditions and laboring lives. Through Antonio and through similar cases of other enslaved chinos committing blasphemy, we see that the Afro-Asian encounter in the early Americas encompassed not only the fluidity of categories, but also converging diasporic trajectories and the sharing of knowledge in order to contest the conditions of bondage. To provide a further example, in 1686, the mother Damiana de San Cristobal of a convent called San Bernardo in Mexico City accused her servant of being a bad Christian. This servant was a woman named Maria Juana from the Philippines that the mother described as a, quote, mulata achinada, or a China-looking mulata. The mother's denunciation accused Maria Juana of saying that she loved the devil more than she loved God. Allegedly, Maria Juana had made a pact with the devil and claimed to have seen him and considered him to be very beautiful. The mother testified, quote, "I give all that my powers can do to subdue the bad nature of this China," end quote. So the mother's language does two important things here. She described Maria Juana as a stereotypically sexually and spiritually deviant mulata, while simultaneously connecting that behavior with that of Chinas, right? So for the mother, this deviance was inherent to these categories. It was quote-unquote bad nature rather than a learned behavior. At stake in this language was the very possibility of Catholic assimilation into Hispanic colonial society, right? Could the nature of quote-unquote mulatas and chinas be reformed into good Catholic behavior? The mother had given, quote, all that my powers can do, end quote, with no success. She could not convince Maria Juana to resist the devil's temptation. Although the inquisitors were ultimately prepared to excommunicate Maria Juana, in the end, her confession and pleas for mercy merited a lighter sentence consisting of a stern warning and a mandatory confession of sins. So the stories of Diego de la Cruz, who we began with, of Vicente, Antonio Rosado, and of Maria Juana, exemplify that Chino could overlap with categories of blackness, and simultaneously the categories of blackness, like negro and mulatto, could include people from Asia who had disembarked from the galleons in the Americas. Moreover, these overlapping descriptors reinforce the fact that, however vague and inaccurate, categorization was often based on visual ascription. Markers like achinada or mulatto designated an otherness that was neither indigenous nor Spanish. They marked overseas heritage and perhaps and perceived physical ambiguity. As such, the fluidity of categories in these early histories should caution us against essentializing both the Afro and the Asian poles of Afro-Asian identities. Furthermore, the mestizaje present within Ibero-Asian colonies impacted not only trans-Pacific ethno-linguistic identities, but also the readiness of Asian subjects to intermingle with black people in the Americas. 17th century marriage records reveal that the enslaved who were sold across the Pacific to Acapulco did not isolate themselves from Africans and Afro-descendants. Rather, they readily adapted to the social and cultural customs of Afro-Mexican communities and created new kinship ties that further blurred the caste categories of their descendants. For example, another scholar named Rubén Carrillo Martín found that 80% of enslaved chinos in the city of Puebla during the 17th century married Afro-Mexicans. High rates of intermarriage between chinos and Afro-Mexicans were not exclusive to Puebla either. We have numerous examples from Mexico City as well, such as the marriage between Miguel de la Cruz, who was described as a free negro, and Dominga, who was an enslaved china in 1675. The children of these unions were often categorized as Afro-descendants, like the enslaved son of a chino who was named Manuel Martin, who was described as a mulatto when he killed a man in self-defense in 1670. Right? So the son of a chino was called a mulatto. This blurring of categories in the second and third generation of people descended from chinos helps to explain how chinos became known as Afro-Indigenous by the end of the colonial period, as exemplified by this Casta painting. While Asians crossing the Pacific indeed continued to be called chinos in colonial legal records, the Casta paintings, as well as influential writers like Alexander von Humboldt, reveal that the meanings denoted by the category itself had become contested. For example, Humboldt writes that, quote, "The descendants of black men and Indian women bear at Mexico, Lima, and even at the Havana the strange name of Chino, Chinese," end quote. For Humboldt, these chinos were entirely separate from his racial taxonomy of, quote, "the men of mixed extraction," end quote, who lived in Mexico, who could be, quote, "Europeans, Africans, American Indians, and Malays. For from the frequent communication between Acapulco and the Philippine Islands, many individuals of Asiatic origin, both Chinese and Malays, have settled in New Spain," end quote. Thus, there was no intrinsic relationship for Humboldt between the many individuals of Asiatic origin and chinos, who he understood to be Afro-Indigenous. The ways in which generational mestizaje or mixing blurred the Afro-Asian binary in turn raised questions that lead us to other silenced histories that continue to reveal the complex multi-ethnic realities of colonial mestizaje and convergence. Namely, modern investigations of the Afro-Asian binary in the Latin American context regularly miss the fundamental role of indigeneity as a third nexus, just as central as the former two, as we already saw in the case of the Indios Chinos of Acapulco. After all, most chinos, as I've mentioned, had been Indios in Manila. In order to reclaim their Indio status in the Americas, as another scholar named Tatiana Sejas argues, many Asians attempted to integrate into indigenous communities by paying tribute alongside them and by adopting indigenous dress, customs, and language. One final example interweaves this process with early Afro-Asian convergence, such that we might better redefine the earliest Afro-Asian encounters in the Americas as Afro-Asian indigenous. In 1693, a man named Alonso Coronel denounced himself to the Inquisition at the age of 72 in Durango on the northern Mexican frontier, which we see represented here. He denounced himself for having committed the sin of bigamy, or having married twice. During the initial self-denunciation, Coronel described himself as an Indio born in Lima, Peru, and he was the son of Cristobal Perez, who was a Kapampangan man from the town of Macabebe in the Philippines, who had arrived in Mexico on one of the galleons. Later, he described both of his parents as Kapampangan, but his primary identification remained as an indigenous person born in the city of Lima. The implication, of course, was that chinos could not also be native to the Americas. One witness expressed considerable confusion about Coronel's identity as a, quote, "seemingly Chino native that says he is from the city of Lima," end quote. It was only the commentary of ecclesiastical officials who would identify Coronel formally and primarily as a Chino and well-connected with other Chinos who were living in the town of Durango. These debates over whether he was an Indio of Lima or a Chino by descent from two parents from the Philippines were not simply terminological debates. By claiming an Indio ascription and by denouncing himself, Coronel sought minimal inquisitorial retribution for bigamy. Right? However, a physical description characterized him as having, quote, "the skin color and eyes that those who are called Chinos in Mexico City usually have," end quote, which all but confirmed his vulnerability to the full procedures of the Inquisition, right, as a Chino and not as an Indio. During the trial, we learned that Coronel had traveled from Lima to Spain, then back to Mexico, where he first married an enslaved mulata named Leonor de Hinojosa on a cacao plantation in a town called Petatlan near Acapulco. Together, this couple had a son and a daughter born into enslavement, because, of course, enslavement was inherited matrilineally. Right? So if the mother is enslaved, even if the father is free, the children will be enslaved as well. While based out of this town, Coronel, like the other Chinos in the area, ran a mule train in which he sold goods from Acapulco to the north, to Michoacan. For many residents of colonial Mexico, the lauded trans-Pacific galleon trade consisted solely of these mule-trained drivers, like Coronel, arriving to town bearing strange wares. Frequent travel meant that Leonor would have been almost entirely responsible for taking care of this couple's 2 children. After 9 years, Leonor fell ill, and rather than caring for his sick wife and taking over the raising of his children, Coronel decided to abandon the family. On the way out, he stole 172 pesos from his wife's enslaver. Coronel then wandered far north and married again at the age of 71 to a quote-unquote white-faced woman who was later referred to as a morisca, meaning that she had an indigenous grandparent. When called to testify, Leonor's enslaver reported that she had in fact died in 1688, or 5 years prior, from disease. And he referred to the 2 mixed children of Leonor and Coronel as quote-unquote mulatillos, which is a derogatory diminutive form of mulattoes. Right? So this word fully reduced the complexity of the children's transoceanic heritage to their status as enslaved Afro-descended children. The son, Jose, had died at age 4, and the daughter, Maria, was 16 and still enslaved at the conclusion of the case. Since Leonor had already died by the time Coronel had married again, the inquisitors merely reprimanded the man and confirmed the legitimacy of the second marriage. So although self-denunciation to the Inquisition at an advanced age was a common appeal to saving one's soul and receiving absolution before death, for Coronel, it may also have served the practical function of long-distance information gathering that would otherwise have been impossible for him. He learned that Leonor, his first wife, had died, and that his daughter, Maria, still lived, and we do not know what became of her. So while Coronel's self-fashioning as an Indio from Lima may not have affected the verdict, since Leonor was found to have passed by the time he married again, it is perhaps more important that the case gave Coronel an opportunity and a motive to make a primary claim of indigeneity as a Lima native while simultaneously relegating his second-generation identity as a descendant of Philippine parents to a secondary position. Coronel's mobility as a free indigenous subject of the Hispanic colonial world placed him in settings permitting the legal formalization of intimacies with both Afro-descended and indigenous-descended women. His life exemplifies the long geographic, generational, and reproductive reach of trans-Pacific trajectories in the early modern Americas. So Coronel, Leonor, and their children's multivalent identities encourage us to think in ever more complex ways about early modern mobility, the triangulation and deployment of Black, Asian, and indigenous markers in colonial Latin America, and how these understudied origins can help us develop a new historiography or new historical thinking of multi-ethnic convergence in the early modern world. At its broadest, these linkages best exemplify the oceanic connections that define the processes of mestizaje and mulataje in the hemisphere. The funneling of extremely diverse populations into discrete categorization schemes in colonial Mexico reveals the simultaneous inaccuracy and capaciousness of racialized discourse of the period. Afro-Asian and Afro-Asian indigenous convergences thrust the configurations of early modern racial formation into stark relief, just as they foreground how individuals subverted the seeming solidity of colonial categorization. In many of the cases that I've just reviewed, legal contingency, alleged criminality, and perceptions of otherness took precedence over ascribed origin when assigning a label. Only after hearing direct testimony from a defendant and expert witnesses did the caste category align more precisely with perceived or ascribed origin. Perhaps most importantly, these histories can help us decolonize the ways we think of early modern Latin American history. Not only does it force us to grapple with multi-ethnic encounters that exceeded the fragile boundaries of colonial racial thought, but it also forces us to question the categories in hierarchies at the center of archival knowledge production. These are histories of how people about whom we know very little and who were often enslaved connected the world and created new ways of being in global colonial societies. It is these unexpected yet necessary stories that populate my book and that disrupt and reconstruct the meta-narratives of enslavement multi-ethnic convergence, race thinking, and global colonialism that defined the early Latin American historical process. Thank you. I believe we have time for a few questions.
Yeah, we have time for a Q&A, and as a reminder, the first question must come from a student.
Hi. Oh, jeez. My name's Lily. And what got you interested in this topic?
Yeah, that's a great question. Once upon a time, I was a graduate student in search of a dissertation topic, and the person who would become my dissertation advisor recommended, once she learned that I was interested in the ways that empire in the early modern world was global in ways that we often don't imagine, recommended that I read a particular book. And this book was a late 16th century book by a guy named Juan González de Mendoza. He wrote this bestseller, a second book, actually, to be published in Spanish about China. And this was an international bestseller when it came out. It was translated into every European language, reprinted dozens of times. And what really struck me about this book is it's a kind of commentary on Chinese civilization from the Spanish perspective. And what really struck me is that again and again, this writer said that Chinese civilization exceeded Spanish civilization in so many categories, and especially in its antiquity. And so he recognized that China had a print culture that went back a couple of centuries before the arrival of the print press in Europe, that the Chinese had gunpowder before Europeans did, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a kind of crisis of identity that occurs there, because of course, writing and military technology were two things that the Spaniards would lord over other groups that they would encounter in the Americas. Visual writing systems in the Americas notwithstanding. So it creates this kind of crisis of empire, really, in the source. And that absolutely fascinated me. And it became a kind of new way of thinking about empire, not in the Pacific especially, not as this kind of top-down construct, right, this hegemonic power, but to think of empire rather through its limitations, and to think about the spaces where empire frays and comes undone. And that's precisely what characterizes the Spanish presence in the Philippines. But once I took that perspective actually back to the Americas, I found that that was more often the case than not. Right? Outside of a handful of urban centers, European influence was really quite minimal. It might have been the presence of a single missionary in a population of thousands, for example. Or it could have been the arrival of tribute collectors a couple of times a year. Right? Ultimately, this is quite a minimal presence, right? So that became a kind of new way for me to think about colonial histories in the Americas. So that's the kind of professional answer to the question. And the second answer is I come from a family with Chinese-Cuban heritage. I was raised in the South. I didn't know anything about what it meant to be Chinese or Cuban when I was growing up. And researching this topic was, even though my family history is more modern than the early modern period that I'm studying, it was still nonetheless a way to think about people who crossed this space and who also had to confront what it meant to be Asian and Latin American as well. So.
Thank you for coming to speak with us today. You mentioned toward the beginning of your talk that the ambiguity, and throughout, of course, the ambiguity of the language and the varieties of terms were factors which potentially allowed for not just manipulation and suppression of the power and potential and identity of the those of Asian ancestry, but you also mentioned the potential for social mobility, and I'm wondering, if you have any more stories a story you could share with us of potentially either those of Asian ancestry who perhaps were able to form communities which held on to their tradition, or maybe which were able to use the ambiguity of their status to better ends.
Yeah. So that's a great question. There are examples. Of social mobility in the archives, and the way that this gets marked is through applications for licenses to do various things. So I mentioned that chinos, like other caste categories, were formally prohibited from participating in a variety of activities, right? But Spanish colonial law allowed for individuals to petition for exceptions to those rules. And by demonstrating their exceptional quality, they might show, in order to demonstrate their exceptional qualities, they might say that they had entered into a Catholic union, they had children, they paid tributes, and therefore, they may have served the crown in various ways, they may have fought in various wars, and therefore they should be granted a special dispensation in order to, I brought up briefly the example of cutting hair, right? This was, there was a sector in Mexico City of Asian hair cutters that was actually quite famous during the 17th century. So it's through these license petitions we can see how individuals tried to claim that they were chinos, but not like chinos, not like the other chinos, right? They were exceptional chinos in some way. But in claiming their exceptionality, they also kind of demonstrate that the overwhelming majority really never had access to those pathways of social mobility. But nonetheless, there are still a couple of examples of people who attained surprising wealth even during the colonial period. I mentioned that there were people who were chinos who themselves became enslavers, for example. There's an example of one person who came up in my research, a guy named Pedro Helen, who in Acapulco served as a drummer in the garrison at the fort for more than 20 years. And he had been had a kind of elevated position on the shipboard hierarchy when he came across too, as a kind of intermediary between the Asian sailors and Spanish officials. And he was himself a slave trader. And had acquired quite a bit of wealth during his time at the garrison. So we do have some examples, right? There are also other examples of people entering, Asians entering religious hierarchies of various kinds, right? Serving as people who kept the account books of the Puebla Cathedral, for example. And this was another pathway, right? Yeah, great question.
Hi, thanks again for coming. I was wondering if these linguistic productions from Spanish carried over to the other colonial powers in the region, like the Dutch or the Portuguese, or if they kind of had their own systems and their own languages for this very diverse area in this time.
Yeah. So that's a really good question. The closest examples would be in Southeast Asia, I think, rather than in the Americas, because during the 16th and 17th century, I mean, the Dutch presence in the Americas, I mean, compared to the Spanish in terms of actual territorial occupation was really quite small and limited largely to what's now Brazil and various parts of the Caribbean. So there's not a kind of comparable movement of Asian subjects to the Americas through other empires. I mean, we do actually have some evidence from early Virginia colony in the 17th century and even into the 18th century of people who are called East Indians who show up in runaway slave records. But of course, this is a different kind of trajectory too. First to England, from India to England, and then across the Atlantic to Virginia colony and to the Chesapeake Bay area. Yeah, in terms of categorization, that's Yeah, so the example that I gave of the Chinese in Manila who are called sanglayas, right? This is kind of unique to the Philippines. But there are other words that cross, especially between Portuguese and Spanish. And this is in large part because, from 1580 to 1640, the Spanish crown ruled over Portugal at the same time, right? We call this the Two Crowns period. And so subsequently, at least formally, all the Portuguese colonies in Asia were ruled by the Spanish crown, right? Even if there was quite a bit of autonomy between the two. But what that means is that now there's more mercantile activity between Portuguese bases in places like Macau, off the coast of China, in the Spice Islands of Indonesia, and what's now the Malaysian Peninsula, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's more of a crossing of words. And so one example of that is one that I brought up earlier, which is the term cafre, right, to refer to East Africans, right? This first enters Portuguese from Arabic, and from the Portuguese then enters Spanish and shows up in Spanish sources, from the Philippines all the way to the Americas.
All right, I think we'll wrap it up there. So as a reminder, there's a reception next door. If you need flip points, you can scan it. And one more round of applause for Diego Luis. Thank you so much.